The second most popular video on this YouTube channel is about aspect ratios, where I explain what they are and gave examples of when to use the different options. Well, I just finished watching the first season of WandaVision, and I have to applaud Marvel. Because the way that they used aspect ratios and even changed them mid-scene is something that I have never seen before and definitely had a huge impact on the... Hey everyone, Camber here, showing you how to use your camera to make good videos. And real quick, if you don't know what aspect ratios are, then look in the description for the link to my original aspect ratio video so that you'll know what I'm talking about here. But now let's look at how WandaVision used various aspect ratios in a way that I have never seen before to better tell the story throughout the series. And there are spoilers here, so you have been warned. As you'd expect from any Marvel movie, we get the opening Marvel sequence showing the logo in the standard 21:9 cinematic aspect ratio. But now it starts changing mid-sequence to a 4:3 aspect ratio with a black and white picture. So why do they do this? Well, the show starts out in a period sometime in the 1950s to 60s, and in this time period, obviously shows were in black and white, but they were also recorded in a 4:3 format, which was the standard for televisions at the time. And at the end of episode 1, the aspect ratio begins to expand from 4:3 back out to 21:9 as the camera also begins to move backwards to reveal to us a 4:3 television screen that's displaying the show with someone sitting there actually watching the show. So this is our first indication that something isn't quite what it seems. Then in a later episode where the show is now set in the 70s to 80s time period, we see that it's now in color, but we're still in that 4:3 aspect ratio of television programs from that time period. Then in this scene, we see Wanda confronting Monica, but we don't actually know what happens to her because the scene cuts away. And then when Vision comes back in to see what's going on, the aspect ratio begins to stretch from 4:3 back out to 21:9, where we see Monica get thrown out of some kind of force field around the town. This is the first confirmation that Wanda's inside a different world, and the aspect ratios show a clear delineation of that change. Then later on, the SWORD team, with the help of Darcy, intercepts a frequency being broadcast from inside the town, where they begin watching the WandaVision series on an old 4:3 ratio TV that shows what's going on inside the town. Once again, the aspect ratio of the actual show that we are watching at this moment is 21:9 because we are watching characters outside of Wanda's world. Then an alarm goes off, and as they move, the camera zooms into the show and switches back to Wanda's world, where we are now back in the 4:3 aspect ratio of the show. But right after it changes, we see the 4:3 ratio once again start to spread out and change to 21:9 to show how there's an intruder from the outside world in Wanda's sitcom world that she's created.
And an outsider. And right now you are trespassing here.
We then see how Wanda herself calls Monica an outsider and sends her back outside of her sitcom world.
It's all Wanda.
Then we're back to Wanda's world, but we're still in the 21:9 ratio, showing that she's aware of the outside intrusion in her world. And even though Vision suspects something's wrong, she acts as if everything is normal, and then the aspect ratio changes back to 4:3 to show how everything is back to how she wants it to be in her world. So there's definitely a lot of forethought that goes into how they frame these scenes based on which aspect ratio they're going to use. However, so far we've only looked at changes between 4:3 and 21:9, but there is another one that shows up that we are about to analyze. Before we do though, let me know if you noticed any of these changes in the aspect ratio when you watch the show, or if there are any other shows or movies that you've noticed changing aspect ratios, because I would be really interested in checking that out. So once again, we have the Marvel intro logo in the 21:9 aspect ratio. But now instead of 4:3, we're watching the show in a 16:9 aspect ratio. So this tells us that we are now getting into the 90s time period when television shows began to change from a 4:3 to a 16:9 aspect ratio that was the basis for all the newer flat screen TVs being made at the time. And as Wanda goes outside of her force field protected world, we see that everyone outside of the town is still being displayed in a 21:9 aspect ratio, showing us that there is still a clear delineation between them and her world, which is now in the 16:9 aspect ratio when displayed.
Am I right?
And then later on, we see Monica push her way through the force field that's around the town so that she can get back into Wanda's world and try to figure out what's going on. We're still in the 21:9 ratio even after she breaks through and enters back into the town. But after she realizes she's made it and starts to search for Wanda, the ratio changes back to the 16:9 ratio of Wanda's world. Then in a later episode when Wanda is searching for her missing children, the ratio is still in the 16:9 format of her sitcom world, but as she starts to sense that something is out of the ordinary and not right, the ratio slowly changes back to 21:9, which based on previous episodes tells us that there is some outsider who's intruding in her world. This is confirmed when Agnes reveals herself as Agatha, and then we see a quick recap of how she was behind everything that's been going on. As the sequence starts, the ratio changes from 21:9 back to 4:3, showing the initial time period of the show. And then as the sequence progresses from episodes in the 70s and 80s to the 90s time period, the aspect ratio then changes from 4:3 to 16:9. The sequence then stays in the 16:9 ratio through the ending of the episode to show how Agatha has been the cause of most of Wanda's problems in her sitcom world. When the next episode picks back up with Wanda and Agatha in the chamber under Agatha's house, the aspect ratio is back to 21:9, showing how Wanda is no longer in control and her world is now being influenced by outside forces. And as we move on to the final episodes, the aspect ratio remains at 21:9 throughout the rest of the series because the outside world has fully intruded into Wanda's world, and her perfect sitcom dream life that she has created has now been shattered to the point where she cannot go back. So that was definitely a lot going on in the show with all the various aspect ratios based on the time period of the sitcom as well as how they changed based on what was going on in the show. But I hope this was helpful in showing you how effective something as seemingly insignificant as choosing an aspect ratio can be and how big of an impact it can have on the storytelling aspect of your video to make it even more interesting. But if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. I'll try to answer anything I can and help you out, help you understand. I also have a private Facebook group linked in the description where you can join and we talk about these kind of things. Subscribe if you're new, watch more videos because I have a ton of things on the channel that will help you learn. Just try using the search function if there are things you want to know about. I probably have made a video on it. But with all that, I will see you in the next one.